Hello, my name is Dr. Chris Magryta. I am a pediatrician at Salisbury Pediatric Associates, and I am here today to talk about infection avoidance. And we're specifically going to be thinking about this perspective of infection avoidance in children, but we're also going to take a look at the maternal side of this equation in context of how that plays out for the child. So being a pediatrician, I tend to look at everything from those two lenses. I tend to care a very large amount about how mom cares for herself and how mom's outcomes play out for the child. And then I care a ton about how these children live their lives within the framework of what's happening in the exposome, the world that we have around us. And so let's go and think about what are the upstream levers that we can pull on in order to enhance the outcome of children as it comes to us from the perspective of infection avoidance. And so primarily I want to split this into two halves. I want to look at it from the maternal half. What's the immune configuration that the child inherits from mom and how that plays out for them? And then I want to look at all the postnatal events that follow. What's occurring in the child's life that could affect this infection possibility or the infection predisposition that they may live with throughout their life. So what do we know about the history of infections as it relates to children? Was this something that children got sick all the time? Are they sick more now than ever? Are the disease inputs different? Are we seeing more bacteria now than we used to? Are we seeing more viruses now than we used to? And we have to look at this from the perspective of the first few years of life. And so primarily, if you look over the millennia, over the millions of years of human existence, things have changed dramatically. The advent of sanitation was a game changer for the exposure to infectious agents, specifically bacteria and certain viruses like cholera. Vaccines was another one, game changer in the amount of virus and bacteria that are actually circulating in the environment in hosts around the world. Antibiotic exposure was a massive game changer, right? All of a sudden, diseases they used to kill without any reason to slow them down now had a reason to slow down. Bacteria all of a sudden had something coming at them that they didn't expect that could slow their assault on a child. And then we knew that in the first few years of life, death was actually quite common for most of childhood existence in human history. And then that changed with the advent of these major lockstep changes in human health. Well, you could also throw in hand washing with soap and other things as well. There's a lot, but those are the lockstep changes. How many infections, viral and bacterial, were considered normal in the first decade of life? I'm not too sure we have a great answer on that, but I can tell you in my career in 25 years, it definitely vacillates with what's going on in the environment. COVID was a really good way to take a look at this. And then we really need to be very careful that we separate out viral and bacterial illness, right? Getting sick is common, especially when we think about viral illness. We get a lot of viruses in our childhood in the first 5 years of life. Most of them don't kill us. Bacteria, on the other hand, are not so good, and any bacterial infection is not great for the human exposure. Again, most of the ones that used to kill us no longer kill us because of vaccines, sanitation, and all the other things that we discussed. But there are some that are now continuously bothering us, like pneumococcus with ear infection, sinus disease, pneumonia. We have Haemophilus non-typable causing problems. So we still have a lot of pathogens in the environment that are bothering us, but vastly different than years and years ago. And then historical norms were that the immune system was primed through exposure, right? If you think about most of human history, we lived in environments that were relatively dirty. We had lots of exposure to endotoxin from animals and other sources that trained the immune system right from wrong. The last 100 years and really the last 50 years, this has changed, and we are now less exposed to natural endotoxin from pathogens that don't kill us but make us stronger. This is known, if you look at the Stein study, where they compared the Hutterites and the Amish, their enclaves where they had a higher endotoxin load in the Amish community, but not in the Hutterite community, there was a definite shift towards a predisposition towards allergic type disease, which increases mucus and increases problems like wheezing. And these are the things that actually predispose to more bacterial infections as well. So we know natural immune priming, we're going to get into this a little bit more, is very important, especially in hollow spaces. We care a ton about that. And then also if you think about parasites, we don't have as much exposure to parasites anymore. And so that may be another piece of the framework of the picture that we're talking about as to what was normal, what's not normal. When we look at this slide, we see childhood mortality under the age of 5 years in the United States from 1800 to 2020. And you see this precipitous decline. And what was the precipitous decline due to? All the things that we previously stated. But what you see there at the end is from 1980 until 2020, it's relatively flat. slight declinations, and this is related primarily to improvements in perinatal care and postnatal outcomes of perinatal deliveries. But in general, most of the gains occurred in the early 1800s to the 19s, let's say 30s, 40s, 50s, somewhere around that range. So now we're just fine tuning. And so let's really get into that discussion from the lens of fine tuning. First, we want to look at this from pregnancy, right? The perinatal perspective is critical. And again, I think this is just the way I see the world, and that is just my bias. And then let's look at infancy and childhood. Each section technically is going to have a lot of similar upstream triggers and levers to pull on, but we want to analyze them all and decide what we're going to do. So pregnancy, right? So it sets the immune table. We know this now. There's tons and tons of data out there that what happens during pregnancy sets the immune table for the child, and then the exposome afterwards moves the table around into different positions and changes what's on the table so that our immune table looks like it looks at the end of the day based on all these inputs. But let's stick with pregnancy for now. Key in this discussion, we're going to get into the maternal microbiome. I think that's a main player. Maternal metabolic health is becoming a main player. Maternal nutrient status, and in this case, I'm thinking of micronutrient status. So are we replete with our selenium? Are we replete with our choline? Are we replete with our folic acid in the state of what I would call folate? Are we replete with these things that help the body mature into the state it's supposed to be in childhood? Then I think of maternal stress. I recently interviewed Dr. Stephen Porges, and it's very critical our knowledge now that stress is a big player. And I even want to talk about klotho if people are interested. KLOT, this protein that's involved in early senescence and aging. Turns out that klotho is heavily altered by methylation due to stress. Well, if that's happening during you're pregnant, what is that doing to the metabolic phenotype that follows? Okay, super important. Sleep, massively important. And then what is mom's disease history? Is mom on medicines? Is mom taking anything that's related to inflammation that could drive dysfunction? When we look at this picture, we see the exposome, right? So the exposome is massive to tolerance development. What happens to us antenatally, what happens to us perinatally, what happens to us postnatally drives immune priming. And if you think about the normal, what's the normal supposed to be? Well, mom traditionally, through most of human history, ate a very agrarian, anti-inflammatory diet. Mom went to bed when the sun went down. Mom woke up when the sun came up. Mom would work and do random things that was basically within the purview of her day-to-day life. Not a huge exposure to toxins. These are relatively recent developments in general. And there was a lot of exposure to endotoxin, again, animals, right? And so these things played out for mom to develop who mom is, right? Her microbiome and everything else. That exposome then drives mom's microbiome inside her intestines, inside her lungs, inside her skin, inside her vagina, and then child's delivered, and then, by the way, inherits that microbiome. We're going to get into this a little bit more, but if you look at the slide, what's fascinating here, and this gets into the priming for the child, the exposures at birth, this PAMPs and DAMPs, these are pathogen-associated molecular patterns and damage-associated molecular patterns. These are the receptors, the toll-like receptors, these other nod-like receptors that taste the outside world via protein antigen structures and say, okay, hey, what are you? Do I need to be worried about you? Well, that trains the local immune cells, the NK cells, the MACs, the macrophages, the epithelial cells, the fibroblasts, and all the other cells that are involved in early recognition of probable problems. Trains the dendritic cells, which are migratory. They can go around to different spots and teach T cells. The education of the T cells becomes critical now to developing tolerance. And then we send out into the world B cell lineage and T cell lineage that are trained to know right from wrong. Peanut is food. Pathogen like EBV is somebody we want to worry about, develop antibodies, right? So mom's entire system has been trained this way. And by definition, this is how the baby system is going to get trained. This slide I'm going to show twice in this discussion because I think it's super important. What do we need to develop natural tolerance? Well, interestingly enough, we just discussed it. We need natural stimulation with endotoxin. By the way, we also need vitamins A, vitamin D, and fiber. Why? Because they're critically involved in T regulator cells. Well, we know T regulator cells are super important in dampening immune responses, but oh, by the way, it's also how we are involved in training the immune system right from wrong. Animals that don't have good T regulator function in translational models or humans actually develop disease in a highly rapid fashion, and they tend to be diseases that are of the autoimmune and asthmatic type. So thinking about this moving forward, we're going to talk about this specifically as it relates to the child, but in mom's case, is mom getting adequate source of fiber throughout her childhood, throughout her life, throughout her pregnancy, so that she's primed with a microbiome and an immune system that is tolerant, right? Adequate vitamin A, adequate vitamin D. Are we using too much sunscreen? Are we avoiding the sun because we're indoors too much? Lots to talk about here. But it's very clear that if you have normal T regulator cell function, normal secretory IgA function, and these are coming again through these inputs of fiber and stuff, then you are more likely to have a beneficial tolerance mechanism, which is great for all of us. So we think about it from the pregnancy state, what is necessary and likely sufficient? Well, when you're pregnant, we clearly think that the maternal microbiome is critically important to be in a eubiotic state, or what I would consider the antithesis of dysbiosis, right? So what does that look like? Well, you want to make sure you're consuming large amounts of fiber. I would say north of 30 grams of fiber a day, preferably 50 grams of fiber a day would be great in whole food sources, right? That's very important. You want to avoid antibiotics because antibiotics will alter the microbiome in a way that is normally temporary and you return to a balanced state. But if you get repeated exposures or you get exposed to antibiotics and you're on a diet that's not in keeping with the normal microbiome function or biodiversity, then you could end up in more trouble. We want to minimize stress. Stress has a massive effect on the microbiome, and that could be stress from excessive exercise. That could be stress of the mental type. That could be stress of the physical type. All of these things we want to minimize as best we can. Toxin avoidance, right? So this is super important. We want to stay away from toxins that could be driving changes in immune polarity, driving changes in microbiome function. I think of this again, endocrine disrupting chemicals come to mind here. Sleep, super important. We're going to get into that a little deeper down the road, but sleep is incredibly important because sleep deprivation drives immune dysregulation, right? And we can talk about Clotho again. Sleep in and of itself reduces the ability of Clotho, the protein, to circulate in the system. Well, Clotho happens to be heavily involved in senescence of cells in an early state, right? So if you are having issues with sleep deprivation, you're going to polarize your immune system in the wrong direction to be pro-inflammatory. You're going to decrease the amount of Clotho you have in your system, which is going to have you age faster, which again, all this combined causes one to have a system that is not in keeping with long-term health. And for me, that means you're less likely to have a child that's going to be in the perfect health coming out. Movement's critical, again, for many functions, metabolic. You can look at it from immune health. You can look at movement is important for sleep. There's so many layers to that, right? When I think of a big player in this discussion, we're going to get into a little bit more. I think of nutrition, fructose, ultra-processed foods, right? These are now being thought to cause preeclampsia, being thought to cause prematurity. The work of Rick Johnson is super critical in this space. And I think it's super important that we pay attention to what nutritional inputs are going in and limiting those potential factors that are causing problems. We'll talk a little bit more about that coming up. Vitamin D and A status, as stated, we need to be careful that we're not blocking the sun through indoor behavior and or sunscreens or too much clothing, right? And then nutrition, of course, we want to eat foods that have some vitamin D in it, like cod liver oil or fish, really good for us. Toxin avoidance, tough problem for some folks, but being cognizant of what you can avoid. The Environmental Working Group has a website looking at how to avoid endocrine disrupting chemicals, other things that could potentially disrupt immune regulation in mom and therefore potentially cause problems to the child. And then again, coming back to another whole lever, stress reduction. We want to focus heavily on that. At birth, what is necessary for me in my mind and likely sufficient here? Well, I would state that these are simple, right? Vaginal delivery makes complete sense. This is how you get a really effective vaginal transfer of microbial organisms from mom's vagina and her perirectal space to the baby. This is just what we should expect. C-sections, in my experience, should be only if there's no other option and you have to go down that route. And then we may want to consider some fecal microbial transplants orally. We'll get into that a little bit. But child's microbiome diversity is sort of critical in my estimation towards developing natural tolerance in order to develop natural immunity moving forward. I would highly encourage folks to avoid perinatal and prenatal antibiotics if you can. Again, the reason being is we want to avoid any shifts that could occur in the microbiome that could change the outcome of mom to be more metabolically dysfunctional, nutritionally dysfunctional, or any of those things that come along with it. It's too much for this discussion to get into, but there's a lot to be said in this space. Then you want to breastfeed immediately. You want to latch on, you want to grab the microbes in our mom's breast. You want to grab the microbes that come in via the breast milk. You want to grab all the things that come in via breast milk, like human milk saccharides, to help teach the child's immune system to do better, right? This is just super important. And then we want into toxin exposure naturally. We want to be exposed to normal bugs, right? So we don't want to have a super clean environment that is potentially not in our best interest for immune tolerance development. So I like to think of the microbiome as a forest. Biodiversity is great. The more trees you have that are of different type, there's a protection mechanisms that come along with that. The more you get into one only type of tree, then there's more chance for pests to come in and cause disease, and then you end up in a lot of trouble. So the maternal microbiome, to me, which becomes the child's microbiome, is sort of that same idea. What do we want? We want biodiversity. What feeds biodiversity? Well, clearly it is food. Food, avoidance of antibiotics, avoidance of stress. You want lots of movement, sleep. All these things are known in their own way to have effects on the maternal microbiome. That's going to lead to a better microbiome for the child. So it's not depleted, because depleted microbiomes, biodiverse, weak microbiomes are more likely to be in keeping with metabolic dysfunction, bioenergetic dysfunction, likely inability to tolerate vaccines. We've seen that with Dr. Pakikaro's work. A lot to be said here, but just think of it this way. The microbiome is critical. What mom gives to baby is super important. Then we're going to get into what baby does afterwards to keep that microbiome in great shape. But let's just keep it at that. Biodiversity is key. How do you get it? Lots of biodiverse foods with lots and lots and lots of fiber, lots and lots of different colors. I mean, just think about an agrarian, old school diet. I tell folks all the time in clinic, let's imagine it was 1850, what foods you'd be exposed to. That's what I'd like the predominance of your diet to be, 90%. Now I want to just quickly touch on microbial transfers at birth. We really want to consider that if you are delivering by a C-section, which historically used to be around 6% in 1970, now we're looking at roughly 32% and rising in the recent decade. This is not in good keeping with a diverse microbiome and a diverse transfer of healthy microbiome to a child. So something to consider is a vaginal microbial transplant. Discuss it with your provider. I think this should become commonplace. It is not yet. The reasons behind the why I don't think are reasonable. But again, as with always, is something you need to discuss with your provider, whether or not you think that's a great idea, or your patients. Let them know that I think this is a great idea to think about this. But vaginal microbial transplants significantly accelerated gut microbiota maturation and regulated levels of fecal metabolites and metabolic functions, including carbohydrate, energy, amino acid metabolism within 42 days after birth. That's directly from the paper, right? So overall, vaginal microbial transference is likely safe and may partially normalize neurodevelopment and fecal microbiome in cesarean-delivered infants, right? Again, directly from the paper. That is from Zhu et al. From the journal Cell, Host, and Microbiome in 2023, for those who want to look it up. But just think about it this way. For most of human history, vaginal transfer of microbial flora occurred naturally. This is what we do. So to say it's not safe because of a C-section really makes little sense to me. If you have a known case of herpes, then you would obviously not do it because of that risk. If you had a known case of some other reason why, group B strep, you could consider at that point, okay, the risk doesn't outweigh the benefit, so we don't do it. But again, just a discussion, super important. I think this is something that we need to pay attention to. Maternal probiotics, which ones would I consider to be the best types? This is, again, early data, need more work, but I think Bifidobacter infantis subspecies EVC1 has a really great immunologic profile, been well studied. It has all of the genes to produce the enzymes that help break down human milk saccharides for the baby. So it makes sense to me that maybe moms could take these in order to transfer it to the child. Not studied. I've talked to the company. Something that should be looked at potentially down the road, but not yet. But something to think about. I don't see any risk here. But again, something to talk about with your provider, share with your patients, that this is something to look into. And then maybe maternal use of Akkermansia mucinophilia, right? And why? Because we have a problem in this country with massive amounts of dysfunction related to metabolism, right? We have diverse quality diets that are unfortunately leading to more metabolic disease. And it turns out that Akkermansia is a player in this game because it increases GLP-1, which we know is very important in increasing satiety, increasing insulin sensitivity and release, and so many other things that are in keeping with healthy maternal metabolism, which leads to healthy child metabolism. And by the way, healthy child immune function out of the gate early on. This slide here, I think, is super interesting to look at because I think the function of it shows us that metabolic disease risk is truly tied to microbial diversity. The more complex the microbial makeup of a microbiome, the less disease risk you have, right? The less microbial diversity, the more disease risk you have. But oh, by the way, there's your silver lining. The hope point here is that that's the place where the most intervention nutritionally will have the biggest bang for its buck when it comes to trying to change the outcomes for the child. I think this is super, super important. Breastfeeding. I struggle with this one tremendously, never wanting to make a mother feel hurt, shamed, or in any way unhappy by a conversation around breast milk, but breast milk is the best thing on the planet for humans. It is free. It is loaded with everything we could possibly imagine from an innate immunity perspective. There's a nice slide here that I think if you look at it, you'll see that it's loaded with human milk oligosaccharides, right? These are the sugars that the human child cannot eat. But oh, by the way, the bacteria in the gut do. And they release then short chain fatty acids and different metabolites that the human then uses, the enterocytes use for immune function, right? There's lactoferrin, there are mucins, there is lactohedrin, there's passively transferred IgGs, which are beneficial in preventing infection in the child perinatally and postnatally. There are cytokines against infection. There are white blood cells that are transferred. There's antimicrobial peptides. There are omega-3 fatty acids, which have resolvins and protectins, and on and on and on. Breast milk is just straight up the best choice on the planet for every child. If mom cannot breastfeed, obviously that is just unfortunate, but that is the reality, and we love them. We sympathize with their plight if they cannot, but breastfeeding from an immune perspective is so super important in that first year of life that I am a heavy 5,000 more heavy proponent of breastfeeding for all of our patients, and that's just the way it is. I don't know what else to say here other than never meant to shame, always meant to educate. When we think about breast milk, we want to think about also, if you are breastfeeding, what could potentially make your breast milk supply less than optimal, right? And in this case, I would think of sleep deprivation right off the gate. If you are not sleeping well, you are going to be stressed, and that's going to put pressure on your breast milk supply. Physical and mental stress, both of them play into this. So if you're overexercising, that's going to do it, right? If you are stressed out mentally because of work, that's going to have a play in this, right? So we want to be very cognizant of stress. Dehydration, not drinking enough water, that's a problem. Poor nutrition intake. If you're not eating enough volume, that's going to be a player in this. Hyperglycemia, known to mess with this. So we want to make sure the diet is replete with foods that are not prone to spiking blood sugar. And then ultimately infections. We want to stay healthy ourselves so that we therefore don't get sick, needing antibiotics, needing some other reason, needing a medicine that would preclude us, one, breastfeeding, and two, would potentially have a downstream effect on breast milk volume, which would not be in best interests. Clear evidence that hyperglycemia will drive immune changes from a study in the journal Frontiers of Immunology. Desena, Avalar et al. Looked at breast milk and hyperglycemia and found that hyperglycemic mothers had higher secretion of cytokines and chemokines in their colostrum, with a higher concentration of gamma interferon, IL-6, and IL-15, and lower concentrations of IL-1R. What does that mean in the long run? Well, this means that it's pro-inflammatory, right? In the short run, you say, well, that might be pro-infection killing. That might be great. Well, it turns out not to be the case. And we want to really avoid that. And again, it doesn't make sense in the context of human history, right? So if you think about the context of human history, hyperglycemia was not a common problem throughout most of the millions of years humans have been on this planet. If anything, the exact opposite would be hypoglycemia because of periods of time where you did not get access to food. So in totality, when we think about the whole picture of mom, we want to really look at this from the perspective of what was expected to be. We want mom to be not stressed, happy, protected, rested, eating a nutritious diet that is anti-inflammatory in all ways. We want mom to have adequate sleep capabilities, to be given the opportunity to sleep the hours needed, but also in an environment that is sleep inducing, that is lovely for what would help mom get adequate deep sleep at night. That again, these are all levers that we can pull on in this, this painting of the existence of the mom for the best outcome of the child. We want to make sure mom is able to move frequently, exercising modestly every day, getting access to sun exposure for vitamin D. We want to make sure there's adequate access to vitamin A through red peppers and salmon and other foods. And we'll get into that a little bit more on the child side of the story as which foods are the best, but these are important pieces of this. We want a vaginal delivery if possible. We want to avoid antibiotics, we want to avoid antacids, we want to avoid drugs, period. We want to keep the microbiome as healthy as possible through lots of fiber, right? So again, hitting on these levers over and over again, fiber for the microbiome that's going to be transferred to the child. Consider probiotics, again, with conversations with your provider. Consider reasonable amounts of water that keep hydration up. Again, this would be for pregnancy and the post-pregnancy state when breastfeeding. So many levers here that we want to think about for mom in order to have the best microbial transfer for baby, but also best immune transfer for the child via the bloodstream while pregnant. Because again, mom's blood is what baby's blood is throughout the entire period of time where we're hooked up the umbilical cord. So if it's a pro-inflammatory blood type, then that is what cytokines and chemokines are going to be sent to the baby. And I think these are all independent risk factors for worse outcomes. And I think this is a main player in the world of autism, in the world of neurobehavioral problems, or what some people call neurodiversity. Again, data coming out now that high amounts of stress will have a downward effect in a negative way on immune function. And again, clotho, right? And there's independent data that shows that those mothers that have high stress are more likely to have children with neurodiversity problems, right? And this is a big deal. So if you are stressed, we have biomarkers that are coming. Like, again, if we can test proteins, we might know somebody's under a huge amount of stress. So we can dive into the social determinants of need for mom to understand, hey, this is something we want to pay attention to in order to potentially mitigate these risks moving forward. All right, so that's the global picture of the levers to pull on for mom and her child. Now I think it's time we're going to switch over into the conversation of the first year of life. Philip, this may be a place to think about splitting this into two different lectures. Not sure, something to think about, but it may be worth even me redoing that first one from the perspective of mom a little deeper, and then doing this one as deep as it's going to be from the perspective of the child. But I'll leave that up to you guys, whatever you decide. But as I've been going through this, I think this is sort of critical. And this piece right here, obviously, is the main one around what we want to do for children from birth to a year of age and on for the outcome that we're looking for, which is reduced infections. So now that we've touched on the pregnancy state and the perinatal period for a child to be born, we want to now think about what's the first year of life like. You know, we went through the data that we know that for most of human history, death in the first 5 years of life was not insignificant, right? So this is a huge problem for most of human history until the advent of sanitation, antibiotics, vaccines, more higher quality nutrition, and the like. So now that we're living in that world, what do we know when it comes to what we can do now, considering those things are sort of controlled? Why do kids get sick more often now? What are the variables, right? And so when I think about the first year of life, I start to think about infant diet, right? What is the child eating? Are they breastfed, right? Did they consume formula? Are they eating regular foods beyond 4 months of age? Are they eating foods that have the adequate amounts of iron and zinc, which are micronutrients that have increased needs in that first year? Is the diet replete with vitamins A, C, D, E, iron, zinc, and omega-3 fatty acids, which all are involved in immune function? Does the diet have lots of ultra-processed foods? Does it have emulsifiers, which are gut irritating? Does it have other chemicals that disrupt the gut microbiome, which again is intimately tied to immunity? And then, are there any food intolerances happening? Is this child having struggles related to milk intolerance? And in this case, beta casein. Something to think about. So when I think about the first year as a pediatrician, I'm always looking for what could predispose them to get sick more often. And the first thing that generally comes to mind in the absence of an immune system deficiency is mucus. If you are overproducing mucus, you are likely going to be predisposed to having more infections. Why? Because bacteria love wet, warm, dark places. I think of hot tubs. If you don't put chemicals in them, you're going to get mold very quickly. You're going to get bacteria in there very quickly, right? So if there's a reason you're developing more mucus, you're going to be at more risk to having infections. So what do I think about here? Right off the bat, first year of life, milk, which is beta casein and soy protein intolerance, right? These are not allergies. These are not your true IgE-mediated allergy. These are intolerances to the protein structure of beta casein and soy, and now we're seeing more corn intolerance. So these kids start to have what looks like colicky behavior, fussiness, reflux, arching, eczema, mucus, diarrhea, often green in color, or paradoxically, as they get older, it's constipation and green in color. And they just don't feel good. You put them on a hydrolyzed formula like Alimentum, mom's breastfeeding, you remove the beta casein and the soy from mom's diet, and these children improve dramatically. And so what I find is that if they don't get these food triggers removed, they have a lot of mucus, which develops a portal of entry for bacteria and viruses to grow and thrive, leading to infection. So that's number one. Number two is pollution. If we are exposed to lots of forest fires, if you're exposed to plug-ins, if you're exposed to other synthetic aerosolized chemicals, vaping, smoking, all of those things are going to produce mucus if you're exposed to it chronically. So that's something to think about in this case. What about the epigenetics of the MUC5AC gene? Potentially you have an alteration, a methylation alteration in the MUC5 gene, which does happen from pollution. Maybe that's at part of this. So not knowing somebody's genetics could be a reason why they have more mucus. So that's something to pay a lot of attention to. But from a frequency perspective, the vast majority of this is milk, beta casein intolerance, soy intolerance. Okay, are we feeding the immune system adequately for full function in that first year? This is, to me, the second big piece of this discussion, right? So if mucus is not the problem, do we have a cofactor deficiency or cofactor insufficiency issue in a child? Are we missing the main, inputs for how the immune system is supposed to regulate itself. And in this case, I'm thinking about vitamins A, C, D, E. I'm thinking about the minerals, iron, zinc. I'm thinking about omega-3 fatty acids. I'm thinking about trace minerals like selenium, and then all the B complex vitamins, right? Are we getting adequate sources of these? And in this, my experience, when it comes to these cofactors, zinc, vitamin D, and iron are the big three. Those are the ones that I see the most when it comes to insufficiency and deficiency states. When I think about this picture here, this comes to us from Nutrients in 2020 by Gumbart et al. And this is just a really good way for you to look at how many cofactors involved in all of the different layers of immune regulation, whether it's physical barriers to the innate immune response, to then the inflammatory response, to the adaptive response with antibodies, then to how is the cell-mediated immunity and human-mediated immunity functioning? Are we adequately supplying the vitamins A, D, C, E, B6, B12, folate, zinc, copper, selenium, and magnesium for antibody production, right? These are the big questions. We're not going to belabor this. This picture is more for your edification of how complex it is. But let's break down into the basics, right? So what do we know? We know vitamin A is important. We can say important 100 times for immune function. It stimulates the differentiation and migration of antigen-presenting cells, their capacity, especially dendritic cells and MACs. Super important because dendritic cells and MACs are these mobile players in the game of finding the pathogens, eating them, presenting their tissue to the T cells, which then primes the B cells, which then gives us antibody response that help us survive over time and develop long-term immunity. Vitamin A is critical here. It also stimulates Th1 function, which is super important in helping fight off infections, right? It reduces excessive Th17 function, which promotes autoimmunity. So it helps keep that all in balance. You need Th17 for extracellular pathogens. Oh, but by the way, we want to make sure that it's not excessive, and vitamin A does that. It also helps keep mucosal integrity of the gut lining, the skin lining, and the lung lining in good shape. So that's functionally very important and needed for adequate immune dampening with B cells by T regulator cell activity. And that's because vitamin A is involved in FOXP3, the gene, forkhead box 3, that turns on T regulatory cell activity. So functions of vitamin A, super important. What are the food sources of it? Well, everybody knows carrots, right? That's just the one we talk about all the time. But broccoli, bell peppers, those are the two that I lean on heavily because kids like red bell peppers. They're sweet, they taste good. Broccoli, another one, great. If you have kids who are sort of picky about that, I tend to mix the broccoli with a little bit of bacon fat. Tends to help them enjoy it more. I do that a lot with Brussels sprouts as well. But again, up to you how you pick the route of intake. Salmon, great source of vitamin A. Mackerel, right? Those are two big ones. Livers, huge fan of liver, chicken livers. Mix it with some good quality bison or grass-fed beef. Great, great, great stuff. So something to think about there. Here's a nice picture of all the different ones you can look at. But this is the way I think of it from a vitamin A perspective. How about vitamin C? Everybody knows about vitamin C. Linus Pauling made it famous. Vitamin C, super important. We know about it from deficiency states. You get scurvy, skin cell breakdowns of tissues, breakdowns of blood vessel walls, all those kind of things. But most people don't have that. But a vitamin C insufficiency for the meeting the needs of the environment may be legit. What does vitamin C do? It stimulates innate immune activity. Again, here we are, macrophages, neutrophils, dendritic cells. Vitamin C is important there. It regulates cytokine production, especially interferons, which are the first sort of cell signals that say, hey, a virus is here. Let's go tell everybody what's going on. It keeps NF-kappa B in place, right? Nuclear factor kappa B. It says, hey, if you're over functioning, vitamin C downregulates it so it doesn't get out of control. So it has an anti-inflammatory effect too, because NF-kappa B is super important. But in modern America, we're overinflamed. So vitamin C is helping to downregulate the overinflammation of NF-kappa B. It's sort of a regulator. The immune system is so smart. The body is so smart, takes these cofactors and uses them as needed for function. And then it also has an effect on increasing T and B cell activity. What are the foods that are rich in vitamin C? I think we all know this. Citrus, red bell peppers again, broccoli again. You see these common themes, and tomatoes. Those are the big three that I lean on. How about vitamin D? Well, vitamin D is just the main player in so many things from an immune perspective. People who are low in vitamin D often have significant problems with their current mood issues, dysthymia, stress, which leads to more infections. And oh, by the way, they can't downregulate the natural immune responses, so it can be a long-term problem with adaptive immunity as well. What do we use vitamin D for? Rapid cell turnover, neutrophils, MACs, and K cells again, so a big part of your innate immune system. Vitamin D is also super important for post-infectious immune dampening. So once you get sick, you want vitamin D in there to help downregulate the immune response. You don't get overinflamed, overdamaged, which then can lead to more nituses of future infections. And then it's involved in NADH recycling, which is super important for mitochondrial function, but oh, by the way, also production of superoxides like hydrogen peroxide. Source of vitamin D, number one by far is the sun, but then, by the way, oily fish, right? Cod liver oil, and then, fortified milk. Not a big fan of milk myself, but for those who are not intolerant to it and take a little bit of it, there's some benefits to that. How about vitamin E? Well, vitamin E has been long known to be super important in many cellular functions, but from an immune perspective, it enhances T cell activation and activity, which is good because T cells are super important at being trained right out of the gate from the innate immune system to then go and help talk to the B cells for adaptive immunity. It improves MAC and NK cell function. Again, vitamins A, C, and E heavily involved in innate immunity. Increased antibody affinity and action, very good. You want that. You want the antibodies when they find what they like to bind to it simply and easily. Great. And by the way, vitamin E is involved in clotho. Again, you're going to keep hearing me talk about clotho. This is the new up and coming big discussion point around human health and human longevity. Clotho happens to be heavily involved in immune function, immune regulation. If you have high levels of clotho like children do, 6 times the amount of clotho in a baby in the cord blood at birth to elderly person towards the end of their life. So clotho is really important for cell signaling, cell regulation, metabolism, immune function, right? So if vitamin E actually enhances that. So we want to make sure we're getting adequate vitamin E. Where do we get our vitamin E from? Well, cod liver oil again. Here we go. Discussing that. When grandma gave cod liver oil, there was a reason behind it. And people up in the Scandinavian countries figured this out long before many other cultures did. Other sources, seeds, nuts, salmon, another one of these foods. By the way, there's our friend broccoli again. But, well, you got avocado and spinach. So other sources of vitamin E, but I tend to think of nuts as one of my favorite sources of vitamin E and seeds. But cod liver oils again. Now we're going to talk about zinc. Zinc is one of those cofactors of the big triad for me in clinic. When I see kids who are struggling with immune function despite doing all of the stuff right with food, sleep, stress reduction, everything, then I'm going to look for big 3, vitamin D, zinc, and iron, right? And so when I think about zinc, I think about normal function of zinc is it's needed for innate immunity. So you got, again, your neutrophils, your macrophages, your NK cells that are out there to taste the word, sample any pathogen that enters the body somewhere. I'm thinking about zinc in this case. Then also helps with improving interferon activity and TNF-alpha activity. This is great for early recognition and transmission of signals that we have a player in town like a virus. It enhances T cell maturation, which is great to improve T cells getting from their naive state to a functional state targeted towards whatever pathogen it is. And then it also increases dendritic cell chemotaxis to move around the body to train adaptive immunity and other things that need to be done. Deficiency obviously hampers all of those. And this is what we see in kids. The zinc deficiency state, the true deficiency state, is called acrodermatitis enteropathica, which is exceedingly rare. I see that once every 5-10 years at best. But zinc insufficiency is very common. And how does that present? It presents for these children who are getting sick more frequently. They just have a less resilient immune system in the face of a more infectious environment and a more sick environment. Just think about zinc as fast cell turnover. You need more zinc. Skin, immune, gut. What are our zinc foods? Oysters. I had 6 oysters last night. It's a great way to get zinc into your body. Kids, not so much. So where else can you get zinc from? Well, I think of asparagus. I think of ground beef. I think of chicken, liver again, great source. And then foods that are not meat-based, asparagus, spinach, and we talk about zucchini. So those are ways to get stuff into your kids. But again, some big levers to pull on. Liver, chicken liver. You can grind it up and put it in different dishes that kids won't know, but boy, does it enhance what you need for future health. Now we get into the third big player, iron. Iron's going to have a few extra pictures because I think it's sort of critical to understand how important it is that we understand how iron gets into the system, or any cofactor for that matter, gets into the system, gets around the body, and does its job at the tissue site. So first of all, you have to eat it, right? So we're sort of talked about that in general throughout this entire discussion. You got to put it in the body first, the food sources, but then it has to be transported around, right? So it needs a transport media, a mechanism, right? That transport mechanism could be damaged by a single nucleotide polymorphism. We don't know this. You have transferrin to move things around. Then that system has to be functionally driven on and off by hepcidin, right? So that's a protein that's involved in regulating, does iron get in and out of the cell? And oh, by the way, then does it get placed into the ferritin cages? And this is where I want to pause for a second and help people understand. This is critical to infectious development. Viruses and bacteria love iron. They use it for their own replication. So when we get sick, one of the things that happens is we start to take all the iron out of circulation, store it in ferritin cages. right? And that's where you get the word ferritin. That's where you get this lab test ferritin. So if ferritin is high, that doesn't mean you have a ton of iron on board. That means all the iron that was in your serum went into the ferritin cages. So you're actually measuring an acute phase reactant. You're measuring something that happened in the body that might mean they're actually sick. And this could be autoimmunity, not just infectious, but in this case, we think about that. So an elevated ferritin is a marker of something going on inflammatory wise. But in the body, we want to make sure that we have put iron into the system. It's transported to its mechanistic place where it needs to be. It's absorbed appropriately through the cell. It's then utilized as needed, right? And so if you're insufficient because you're not taking it in, or you're not transferring it, or you're not allowing it to be stored appropriately, or you're not having enough storage there for when you do have something going on that the cells don't function naturally, then you have to sort of think about this from all of those perspectives, right? Because iron is critical for all of the functions that occur in the body when it comes to producing energy, when it comes to producing the hydrogen peroxides and the different things that are involved in killing. There's iron mechanisms like lactoferrin, right? So these in breast milk, there's those iron killing mechanisms in place that you need iron for. So it is a very, very important mineral that is not rarely insufficient. Like we see this a fair amount. We see kids who are low in iron often, and I measure that by getting testing, right? So you look at ferritin, we'll get into that a little bit more, but if a ferritin's low, that usually means they don't have enough iron stored around for basic functions. They can make plenty of red blood cells, which is the triage theory of what you need iron for, but not so good for immunity. So we really care about that. So that's that little aside to understand the whole picture, to understand how you need to get it in, move it around, and do what it's supposed to do. And we don't know if a patient has single nucleotide polymorphisms around this, so we want to be very careful to assess adequacy and need. The other big piece of this is that inflammation via the microbiome-based iron metabolism, right? So we have the microbiome using iron repeatedly in our guts for their own health, right? And so that's a good thing. So you need the iron floating around the body for our natural microbiome with its biodiversity to do its natural function. So again, one of the other functions of iron is the homeostatic environment of our gut microbiome, which again is so intimately tied to our immune system. So think about iron not just in the acute state of needing to fight off the infection where we're at, but also this chronic state of maintaining resilience on a day-to-day basis, again, against the function of immune weakness and or infectious pathogen strength. What are the iron foods? Most people know this. Again, this is sort of talked about a lot. I think of this in the context of, are you absorbing it well? So I'm going to sort of take a little aside again. The iron foods that show a ton. We have oysters, we have beef, we have different shellfish like mussels, we have sardines, we have liver again, we have ground beef, we have different kinds of steaks, lentils, and buckwheat groats, right? So those are the sources of iron. You also have iron fortified cereals, which again, if they're sugared cereals, that's not good. But there's also this concern now in society with celiac disease and non-celiac gluten sensitivity and cow milk protein intolerance causing inflammation in the gut, which then leads to poor absorption, right? So fixing all these things in concert, super important, but the iron-containing foods are there for us to teach our patients and for everyone to understand how to get it in our system. Omega-3 fats, super critical. So omega-3 stands for just where the double bond is in the fatty acid chain. And in this case, we're specifically looking for the omega-3, which is the third position of the double bond. These fats are found primarily in fish. They're phenomenally absorbed through that source of intake. There are plant-based sources. It's a lot harder to get it into our system, especially if you have single nucleotide polymorphisms in the ability to process them. But that being said, omega-3 fats are super important for inflammation resolution, and multiple metabolites attack multiple pathways of inflammation. So when you get sick, how you process, how you deal with all that, omega-3s are super, super important in downregulating that inflammatory response. It doesn't get overloaded. So therefore, again, more tissue destruction, more propensity for future infections to happen again in the future. So we really love omega-3 fatty acids for trying to help the immune system stay solvent and stable over a continuum. And again, getting back to that slide from Dr. Tan et al., very important that we're focused on vitamin D, vitamin A, and now the final piece of that discussion point is fiber. Fiber, fiber, fiber. Need lots and lots of fiber for our microbiome, which again is part of the way we get our immune system bidirectional crosstalk with our immune system and the microbiomes in our gut. Biodiversity, good. Weakness of biodiversity, bad. So we want lots and lots of fiber. And then that fiber also is involved in T regulatory cell function again. So we think about that from the perspective of fiber is going to help us get immune dampening post-infection. Super critical to helping us stay as healthy as possible. Where do you get lots of fiber from? Legumes, legumes, legumes. Lentils, split peas, beans, artichoke hearts, chickpeas, avocado, chia seeds, all the different berries, leafy greens. Dr. Bland talks about tartary buckwheat, another source. So I think about all those things. So often I encourage folks to share fiber charts like this one with their patients. That way they can go on and help them go home and think about this from the perspective of high fiber foods. Okay, let's switch gears now from micronutrients or cofactors to macronutrients. What are the macronutrients we want a child to consume? And I actually don't want to make this super complicated. I think it's super simple. We want to avoid all the foods that are more modern that are processed or what we call ultra processed. So we don't want any of the ultra processed carbohydrates, ultra processed fats and proteins. So these are the boxed foods, the packaged foods that are in a flour-based form with lots of chemicals added to them. We don't want the emulsifiers that have been added to different peanut butters and emulsifiers added to our yogurts and our beverages like almond milk. And, so read labels. Less ingredients, the better. The more closer it is to its natural source, a Nova scale of 1, the better, right? This is what we care about. This is what we want to teach our patients and our children, our mothers, everybody, that we want to go as close to old school as possible. 90% is always my number. Try and hit 90% anti-inflammatory whole foods and avoid all the other stuff as much as you can. Fructose, starch are two separate categories for me. And I want to get into this a little bit more in a second, but I think of fructose and starch polymers as a major source of dysfunction, primarily because of something called the polyol pathway and fructose degradation to uric acid. In the end of the day, it's a lot of uric acid that we get. That uric acid is a known trigger for inflammasome activation, immune system dysregulation. So we're going to talk about that a little bit more. Omega-6 fats and saturated fats in high volume are thought to be not healthy for us. So I would encourage folks to not do a lot of seed oils, a lot of processed omega-6 fats, and then definitely no trans fats, and keep saturated fat volume reasonable. And again, I always encourage people to eat their fats with carbohydrates that are high quality, like broccoli, spinach, that kind of stuff. So it's a mix. So the intestines get a nice reception of all the foods in concert, not one macro by itself, because I think that's where more problems come from. Again, historically, I think that's just the reality. And again, avoid additives, avoid emulsifiers, avoid pesticides, avoid endocrine disrupting chemicals, all those things as much as you can. So the good, conversely then, simple answer, whole foods, as close to Nova scale 1 as possible. Carbohydrates, fats, and proteins mixed through every meal. We want lots of vegetables, fruits, nuts, beans, seeds, meat, and fish. That's it. Babies, I want them eating from 4 months of age on. I want them eating vegetables primarily first in a mashed form. Choking is the risk, so you don't want someone to choke. But, there's folks who do baby-led weaning. There's folks who do the historical anthropologic way of feeding. I think that's totally fine. I think the more soft or pureed we make food too much, I think that's a net negative for bone stimulation of the jaw, which is crowding the teeth, which is causing secondary problems. So I think if you go back to the work of Dr. Unger or dentists who are looking at the space like Dr. Thompson, I think we see that we want to make sure that kids are getting exposed to lots and lots and lots of vegetables and fruits and high quality foods early on from 4 months on in a non-chokeable form, but not highly pureed so that it's too soft to stimulate bone health, right? We want lots of complex carbohydrates mixed with the different proteins and fats as they age and as they can tolerate it. So adding in meats when they have their teeth and they can start to grind them up, unless you give them tinier pieces when they're smaller. I think that's fine too. And then we want lots and lots of omega-3 and 9 fats. Olive oil is good and is a good oil to cook with, and fish oil is great. But you don't need to give a child that specifically. I'm thinking more of giving the child some salmon, some of the other pieces. After the age of 1, that's a different story. And then we want lots and lots of colorful foods, the polyphenols, right? Those polyphenols are super important for antioxidant function, which again is downregulating oxidative damage, which is great, keeping the immune system at a quiescent state post-infectious, right? This is how we stay healthy, avoiding inflammation. And again, I want to repeat the mucus story. This is so important for children. Look for milk protein intolerance, soy protein intolerance, corn protein intolerance at the earliest ages. If they're older and they're back on dairy and you're starting to see this pattern when they're 18 months and they're getting ear infections, wheezing, eczema, they're called allergic rhinitis, where they're always mucousy, that's probably a recurrence of the intolerance to milk beta casein when they're older. And I highly encourage a 30-day trial off elimination diet. If their symptoms resolve, you have your answer. If soy needs to be pulled out too, less commonly so in my clinic, but if they need to be pulled out, that's something to deal with. If you have true IgE-mediated allergies, obviously those need to be seen by an allergist and dealt with. Specifically things like, milk allergy, peanut allergy, those are very specific. And if you have IgE-mediated anaphylactic type symptoms, that needs to be in its own way dealt with. And again, we don't know who has, single nucleotide polymorphisms like MUC5AC. So if you see people have more mucus development, you're unsure why, think about pollution, think about toxins in the environment, think about smoke, vaping, all of those things. So what are the first-year levers, right? So when I think about first-year levers to pull on, we made a great case for micronutrients. I think we should be very careful to provide children with the adequate micronutrients through food sources primarily, right? So that's where I'd go first. Secondarily, macronutrients, make sure they're eating super healthy. If that situation is in great shape, next lever is sleep. I would want them to be sleeping adequately. We're going to get into that in a second. I would want them to be moving a lot, right? So kids tend to move a lot. So that's generally not a huge problem in the first 3 years of life. We want them moving outside, running, playing, getting their metabolic system active all the time. Toxin avoidance, super important. We want to stay away from endocrine disrupting chemicals, plastics, aerosolized stuff in our environment, particulate matter, smoke, all of that as much as possible, reducing mucus, reducing immune irritation that could happen. I'm a big fan of vaccines. I think we should be vaccinating children against the major players like pneumococcus with the pneumococcus vaccine, the Haemophilus vaccine, polio. My bias is very strong that I think we've saved more lives than we could ever dream of doing anything the other way from them. That is not to say we shouldn't study them in any way, shape, or form. For those who believe we should study them a little bit harder, I am in agreement. It'd be nice to see that. But in general, I am pro-vaccine. Probiotics, I think there's a good case to be made that probiotics can have a place in a child's life. But I think more important than probiotics is lots and lots of fiber. So I'm going to pull in the fiber lever first and the probiotic lever second. But that's to be discussed with each person and their provider. And then huge hand washing, some basic, simple stuff. Keeping the skin clean, right? So hand washing, 20 seconds is the minimum amount of time it takes for the lye in the soap or the soap in and of itself to break down the cell membranes to kill the pathogens that are on your skin. So lathering up really well, teaching kids how to wash their hands using just plain old soap. Not a fan of these Purells in the world or whatever we call them, the hand sanitizers. I think that's not in our best interests. I think we should be just using plain old soap where we can adequately clean off our hands and get stuff out of our environment that's pathogenic in nature. So there's videos online how to show your kids how to do this. I think it's great. So those are my big first year levers to pull on. Now let's talk specifically about fructose. I think shifting gears here is super important to me because I think if we don't understand what happens with nutritional hyperglycemia or nutritional irritation with uric acid, we're missing one major lever to pull on. Right? So we talked a bit about the best diet, but here's a reason why. Let's get a little bit deeper and granular on this piece. So when you take fructose, right? Well, that's a fruit sugar in the disaccharide sucrose. You have glucose and fructose mixed together. That makes sucrose. Well, glucose is not very sweet, but the fructose is the sweet part. That's why we love it. It's very good. Human history. If something was sweet, it wasn't poisonous, you'd love it, you'd eat it, you'd gain some weight, you'd survive the famine, you'd survive the winter, life would be good. Well, that's not the way life is anymore. Now we know that fructose in and of itself is causing more problem than good because of volume, because the amount people are consuming from young ages and on. Well, the terminal metabolite of fructose is in the gut. It ending up as uric, right? It goes through a whole process of adenosine deaminase. That adenosine deaminase kicks it from AMP to IMP to inosine to hypoxanthine to xanthine, and then xanthine oxidase goes to uric acid. Well, who cares? Well, it turns out that uric acid is a major trigger of inflammation, specifically inflammasomes, NLRP3 inflammasomes, which are pyrins, which are fireballs. So that's not good in a cellular market. So if you have a local cell and you have a lot of inflammation going on there from uric acid, you're going to get tissue damage. Tissue damage leads to inflammation. Inflammation leads to more tissue damage, and eventually you're going to have a nidus for an infection to start. So we care about this. Oh, by the way, fructose is also tied to the uric acid story that is metabolic syndrome. So fructose ingestion is a problem. So we want to limit the exposure to sugar, right? So what is that? So we want to limit the volume of simple sugars that enter the body, high fructose corn syrup. So the beverages, sugar, just general sugar, the beverages, honey turns into fructose as well as it's degraded, right? So we want to be very cognizant of where our fructose sources are, and we want to keep it to only a few grams a day, right? That's just basic knowledge of added sugars, right? If it comes in natural fruit, generally that's okay unless you're eating a huge volume. But for kids, this is super important now because I think this is a part of the immune dysregulation that we're seeing in children. So the other piece of this is dysbiosis, right? So if you look at the perspective of fructose ingestion, that increases uric acid. Oh, by the way, you actually have to have a priming event too. And it turns out that the priming piece of this is lipopolysaccharide, which is a fat sugar molecule in the gut from dysbiotic gram-negative rod release in the intestinal microbiome. Right, so if you have dysbiosis, you're releasing lipopolysaccharide into the systemic circulation. Oh, by the way, that primes the cell that gets turned on by uric acid to kick on the NLRP3 inflammasome that then kicks off inflammation, and you're off to the races with inflammation. Again, chronic inflammation equals chronic risk factor for infection. That's just the way it is. We want to keep inflammation low. So in this diagram, I've sort of laid out a case for the whole story of high glucose or hyperglycemia, as well as the fructose story. So if you see right in the center there, you've got high glucose. And then if you look at high volumes of glucose over time, that causes protein sugar cross-linking, which is what's called an advanced glycosylated end product that hits a receptor for advanced glycosylated end products. That causes increase in reactive oxygen species, which causes mitochondrial damage, which leads to inflammation. Right? Oh, by the way, how about aldose reductase, an enzyme that's involved in converting too much sugar or glucose into sorbitol, which then has a terminal byproduct of being fructose. Oh, that's interesting. That can actually become a advanced glycosylated end product for fructose. So instead of glucose, it's a fructose end product. By the way, glucose in and of itself can turn on in high volumes HIF1 alpha via the downregulation of AMP kinase. That turns on a whole cascade of events that leads to increase in myeloid-derived suppressor cells, the keyword there being suppressor, so lower NK, lower TH1, and increased M1 activity. These are poor inflammatory, poor pathogen killing, very much akin to micronutrient deficiencies we talked about earlier. At the end of the day, that will lead to more infections, more inflammation, more infections. You have a loop effect. All of this is related to tissue damage. Eventually, that can lead to autoimmunity, but that's not for this subject to be discussed, right? So thinking about all these things, high glucose can turn to high uric acid, which then leads to inflammasomes. High glucose can lead to rages, leading to oxidative damage and mitochondrial damage. You know, all of this stuff is linked together. The American diet, the standard processed, ultra processed food diet of our country is replete with high volumes of sugar, high volumes of fructose, high volumes of unhealthy fats in concert that leads to this really gross inflammatory cascade that leads to risk for infections. So that's just a big one. What are the levers you can pull on here? Well, clearly the simplest lever is removing the source, which is high volumes of ultra-processed food, high volumes of starchy foods, high volumes of fructose, like high fructose corn syrup, or just generally fasting. With little kids, we're not going to do that. Older people, that'd be more important. Exercise is key. Super important, right? Stress reduction is key. That's a big one. That's a lever you can pull on because stress reduction actually has a down-regulating effect on these pathways. So even though you might be consuming the wrong foods, it's going to have an effect on that. And then there are herbs and things you consider as kids get older. But again, vitamin D, vitamin A, fiber, probiotics, all super important here. Now let's switch gears a little bit to sleep and circadian biology. In children, I think this is super important. I'm going to touch on a couple big pieces here that sort of come to play in the infectious disease avoidance story. Sleep, diurnal immune activity. It's very clear the immune system turns on early in the morning very strongly. Why? Well, historically, when did we get approached by pathogens? Well, that would be our first contact with other humans that could be sick. When would that be? First thing in the morning, at breakfast time, during work, when you're playing with other kids. So the immune system is geared to be most active, turning on in the morning, and then becoming less active as the night goes on, unless you are sick. So that's interesting, right? Early sun exposure early in the morning is also important. So when you're sleeping well, you're getting up early, you're not trying to sleep in because you didn't sleep well. That early morning sunlight turns on POMC, this hormone complex that is involved in many, many different cascades of events, including adrenal function, cortisol activity, many other things, which all happen to have downstream effects on immune function, right? So these are big. So we want to make sure we're getting up in the morning for sun. That means you have to have a good night's of sleep, right? Sleep disruption is very rough on cellular biology. On all counts, it is well studied. Frontiers in Biology, Nature magazine, so many ways you can look at the sleep deprivation effect on metabolism, sleep deprivation's effect on immune function, sleep deprivation's effect on clotho. I mean, it's all tied together, but at the end of the day, sleep deprivation or sleep dysfunction is very, very taxing immunologically, predisposing us to infectious disease burdens and risk. We see here in the study by Cavison et al. In the Journal of American College of Cardiology, we see a direct effect in a case-controlled study that sleep restriction worsens metabolism, which we know worsens immune function. right? In this study, over a 221-day inpatient visits with a washout period in between of 2 weeks, energy intake increased by over 300 calories a day, body weight went up over a pound, and abdominal visceral fat increased, right? So all bad. And in kids, if this is happening, this is all bad for infection. So again, sleep, super important. How about immunologically? We know sleep downregulates Th1, not good. Upregulates Th2, that's pro-asthma allergies, not good. Downregulates NK cell and CD8 activity, not good for innate immunity, right? Decreases antigen presentation, antibody production. This could be problematical if it's a new virus. It could have a longer time to survive, a longer lead time to grow more, making it harder for our immune system to catch it, control it, and kill it, and put it at bay. So that's more inflammation, more risk, more potential infections down the road. What about sleep deprivation driving the inflammatory train? Clearly, what else? Well, if you're not sleeping well, metabolic waste clearance decreases in the brain. That's problematical because that'll cause increased inflammation in the brain, which leads to poor sleep, which is a loop effect, but also leads to not feeling well in general in the brain, moody, right? That has a direct effect on immune health. So that's a big one. So we want to make sure we're getting deep sleep to clear metabolic waste. And then the changes in circadian rhythm of gene expression. Right? We want to take advantage of making sure that we're sleeping so that the gene expression that's involved in circadian biology is timed appropriately with the rise and the fall of the sun and the moon. This is all intimately tied to immune function in a child and in an adult. And a slide here on vaccines, right? So Irwin et al. In the Reviews of Immunology 2019 showed that sleep disturbance has a poor vaccine response effect. And now we're seeing that data actually in multiple studies showing that timing of day matters for when you get your vaccine. If you have your vaccines early in the morning, you are more likely to have a robust response than if you have it in the evening. Why would that be? The reception of the antigenic structure of the virus is better in the morning when your immune system is ramped up and ready to rock and roll. By the way, if you're inflamed and sleep deprived, all of this stuff doesn't work as well. So it might not even work in the morning well, but it'll definitely be better morning to evening. But the take-home point is pretty clear here. If you look at this picture, you have decreased immune surveillance response, decreased type 1 interferon responses, decreased TH-cell1 responses. All of this stuff is not good when it comes to fighting pathogens, but oh, by the way, responding to your vaccines as well. So sleep is huge. Okay, vaccine biology, we touched on this briefly, but for me, this is an important piece of this conversation. Infectious avoidance for the killers is predicated on high-quality vaccines in children. I mean, that data is so clear that the amount of death that we've seen in children from vaccines has gone down, down, down ever since the advent of vaccination. I lived the period of time in the 1990s when pneumococcus was rampant, killing through sepsis, killing through meningitis. And then pneumococcal vaccine came out in the late 90s, and it seemed like all of a sudden pneumococcus was no longer a killer. It still had variants out that were causing ear infections and pneumonia and sinus disease, but very little of the acute death-inducing illnesses. So for me, vaccines are massive, right? Time of day is better in the morning, as far as I'm concerned, from the data that I see out there. I encourage folks to get their visits for the vaccines in the morning. Microbiome ecosystem is critical. The more biodiversity, the better the response is to the vaccine, and the better immunological response you have in the future will be. So again, coming back over and over again to this microbiome. We want to focus on that. Antibiotic exposure, we want to avoid it at all costs. Kids who have high antibiotic exposure have worsened microbiomes. Those worsened microbiome biodiversity leads to poor responses to vaccines. Michael Piccicaro's work is pretty strong looking at this. Micronutrient cofactors again, right? We want balanced immune function, right? We want to be able to have vitamin A, vitamin C, vitamin D, vitamin E, all these different vitamins on board, and micronutrients like iron and zinc to have normal immune activity to handle the vaccine. It's that simple. Okay, breastfeed, we know that's important. And then we want to avoid any toxin that could potentially lead us down an immune dysfunctional rabbit hole that could make vaccine biology less effective. Movement, I'm not going to belabor this. Everybody knows a lot about movement. Suffice it to say, I think the most important part about movement when it comes to infectious disease avoidance is reducing hyperglycemia, which means you want GLUT4 transported receptors to the cell surface from the nucleus. That happens when you move. That lets sugar go into the muscle independently, and that allows that to be burned. That allows less hyperglycemia, which is a immune irritating state. So we want to continue movement. Immune stimulation occurs with movement, multiple studies on that. There's so much data here. I don't think we need to to get involved in this too much more, but getting back to clotho again, right? Again, this is that anti-senility peptide that children have a lot of. The more we move, the more clotho we make. And it's diurnal. We make more clotho in the morning and less in the evening, according to the data. So we care about this. Why? Because this is how we cellularly regenerate on a day-to-day basis. Movement, movement, movement. Stress. This could be an entire discussion in and of itself, an entire webinar. Suffice it to say that stress is a big, big, big problem in immune function, right? Dr. Porges, polyvagal theory specialist who's coined that phrase, polyvagal theory, has tons of information that we now understand that adverse childhood events are direct dysfunctional state for a child to be in, where their ability to use their prefrontal cortex is gated at the amygdala based on being stuck in a polyvagal state of a dorsal vagal, or what's called a sympathetic to dorsal vagal state. That is not in keeping with human health. That's a poor outcome for metabolism and a poor outcome for immune function. So I am very interested in folks getting stress to the top of the list of things to help a child who's struggling, right? If you have a child who we've gone through all those other things we talked about, which are more of the low-hanging fruit that we know, nutrition, micronutrients, vaccines, these are all important things that we know are simple things to change in general. Another place to look is stress. If a child's not getting better, their micronutrients look okay, they're eating well, we got to dig deep into the stress of to why. Is there an adverse childhood event not being dealt with? Do they need to get into therapy? Could they find a polyvagal informed therapist doing work in this space? To me, this is very important, right? And Dr. Porges is doing some amazing work here. I encourage you to listen to the podcast number 69, where Dr. Porges discusses at length how important stress is, right? So we really want to avoid overarching stressful responses in a human, right? And so when it comes to the immune side of this coin, I'm going to just touch on this briefly. Chronic stress leads to a cortisol-resistant state. Essentially, what happens is the receptor has a problem with a peptide falling down into the nucleus that, instead of shutting off the activity of NF-kappa B, which happens in the acute state, it actually paradoxically now has an ungated NF-kappa B response. And we have tons and tons of NF-kappa B released in a chronic stress state. That's inflammation. Inflammation leads to tissue damage. Tissue damage leads to infection, and we're off to the races. So I think that's super important. We got to really pay attention to this. So at the end of the day, what do? We talked a lot about many levers to pull on, but what about testing, right? Do you just do all these things without testing? And the answer is, most of the time, I don't test unless the child will not heal through the basics in the first 2 to 4 weeks of a conversation like this. So if they're doing the sleep mitigation, they're doing the food mitigation, they're doing the micronutrient mitigation, they're really checking on all these variables and levers, and they're not any better, then I'm drawing labs. And why do we draw labs? Because we want to have an objective measure of why we're not moving in the direction we think we should be moving. So in general, I'll draw red blood cell linked zinc, red blood cell linked copper, red blood cell linked magnesium. I will draw ferritin level. I will draw vitamin D, vitamin A, and omega-3 check. That's usually enough to get the answers I need to pivot the child through supplementation to get us back to immune solvency again in general. If that doesn't work, then you got to go a little bit deeper. I generally like to see at least one CBC to look at white blood cell abnormalities along this continuum. Usually they've had one, so I don't tend to have to order it right out of the gate. And then also start to consider in a child who's constantly mucus-based and it's not milk protein intolerance or soy protein intolerance, think about immunoglobulins, looking to see if they have a problem with immune deficiencies like IgA deficiency. I would think of doing a celiac panel. I would think of doing IgE-mediated testing, looking at allergen possibilities in the environment. Usually this is going to be in your 1 to 2 to 3-year-old, but it's not impossible under 1 to have IgE-mediated disease. So these are things we're looking for if you have what looks like allergic type findings. So in reality, these are all the tests that I tend to run. It can go deeper from there, but those are very rare cases where you need to go farther. But that is in general where I would stick. If you are limited by blood volume and or cost, I would stick with RBC, zinc, ferritin, and vitamin D are the big three. Copper would be the next one, just to make sure the zinc yolk copper issue isn't causing more problems. What do I base my supplements on as far as lab testing? I think about it from the perspective of I want to have sufficiency, because deficiency states are not that common, but insufficiency is. So red blood cell link, I'm aiming for 12 milligrams per liter or more. Red blood cell copper, I'm aiming for 0.6 to 1.2 microgram per milliliter, that range. Red blood cell magnesium, I'm aiming for greater than 5.5 milligrams per deciliter. Ferritin, I'm looking for greater than 50 nanograms per milliliter. Vitamin D, I'm looking for greater than 40 nanograms per deciliter. Vitamin A, greater than 20 micrograms per deciliter. And omega-3 check, I'm looking for greater than 6% of the combined EPA-J divided by arachidonic acid ratio. Okay, so those are generally where I use my lab thing to guide my supplementation volume. Supplementation volume is based on the child, based on their age, so it's really hard to give out numbers for pediatrics right now, but certainly follow the lab testing over time to make sure you're never getting into an overload state. But that's, at the end of the day, the most important piece. When you've done the basics and you can't find answers, lab test, and then supplement appropriately based on lab tests. But again, always going back to food first, try and get foods into the child that fix these micronutrient deficiencies. Okay, that was a lot of information. So if we were to drill it down into the to-do, the list, the what to do, right? I base this on a simple thought process, food first mentality, right? We want it to mostly be from food if possible. Whole food, Nova scale 1, 2, all natural, minimally processed, end of story. Avoid all toxins, drugs, things you don't need, right? If you have to take the drugs, you do it. But on that, avoid all of this stuff. We don't want that in our environment, reducing mucus, reducing inflammation, all that stuff in the body. We want to have minimally stressed lifestyle. We want to move a lot. We want to attach early to our children, hug them, love them, spend a lot of time with them, tell them they are loved implicitly. This does not mean they're enabled. This means that they are loved, right? They are hugged. They are also given consequences for behavior that's not appropriate, but they are loved. And at the end of the day, a child who is loved will always know they are loved, even when they're being disciplined for behavior that's not appropriate. So that is super important. Attach early, love your kids a ton, give them lots of hugs. I would also encourage folks to vaccinate. I would encourage folks to avoid antibiotics, encourage folks to just think in an anthropologic viewpoint. In number form, I look at it this way. In the pregnancy state, I would focus on immune health with consistent sleep, stress reduction, whole foods, organic diet, toxin avoidance, 30 minutes of daily sun exposure, and consider a prenatal multivitamin. And there are some really good brands out there that are filled with methylated B vitamins, choline, good stuff. Postnatally, breastfeed if possible. I would encourage a thought process around potentially looking into B. infantis or Akkermansia probiotics, and then definitely continue a healthy diet. Infancy, begin foods at 4 months of age with vegetables, minimally pureed foods so they can chew on it and stimulate gum and jaw motor activity, which is good for teeth over time and good for motor health and oral motor function. And then making sure these kids are sleeping well at night in those early months. Look for milk protein intolerance, look for soy protein intolerance, look for other signs of mucoid-induced inflammation. Number 5, whole foods, organic diet, minimizing starches and promoting phytonutrients. I think that's been laid out pretty clearly in this conversation. 6, target supplemental micronutrients based on lab work, right? That's at the end of the day when you've gone through all these basics, you've done some work for a while, and you can't get the answers you want, look for objective measures of disease. 7, spend lots of time outside in nature as soon as possible after birth. Animal exposure appears to be a strong net positive. Again, the Stein study is super important here. And early morning sunlight, right? So get out there, get the sun on your eyes. That's triggering POMC and a lot of cascades of epigenetic function that we really want for immune solvency. 8, be attached to your children emotionally. Be ready to parent, right? This is important. Love them so much that you're going to parent appropriately. 9, maintain adequate sleep volume and frequency, right? That's a big one, right? Sleep, 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 sleep. Volume and frequency, just super important. And then finally, look for adverse childhood events in kids. This happens often, unfortunately, in pediatrics. And so we're always on the lookout for stress that is unrequited or traumatic of nature that could be a break point in the child's physiology. That's not in our best interests. So at the end of the day, I hope you think of infection avoidance from a multimodal perspective that is anthropologic at its root, that says all of the problems that are happening likely have an antecedent upstream cause. And for me, that would be something that I would say, hey, let's go and change upstream targets, antecedent inputs, and make the day a better day for the child. Ultimately, chronic inflammation is a root cause of infection. Chronic mucoid secretion is a root cause of infection. Chronic micronutrient dysfunction, chronic microbial dysbiosis, all these things are problematical. So we want to hit on those levers all the time. All right. I'm Dr. Magryta. Hope you had a great day. As always, hug those kids. I appreciate you listening and happy travels.
Welcome to Root the Health, the best place to order, manage, and track results from over 30 different lab companies in one single place for free. It's going to take you under 2 minutes to sign up, and you can order any functional medicine lab for your client in under 30 seconds. Let me show you how it's done. So here's our beautiful interface. I'm typing in the name of my client, selecting the lab that I want to order for them, and hitting send. From there, Rupa and their amazing team handle the rest. They email the client, collect payment, and even offer an interest-free 3-month payment plan. We've also built the world's largest library of information about chronic health conditions, the lab tests that can help you find the root cause, and the evidence-based interventions that you can use to help people heal from them. It's called the Rupa Health Magazine. There, we have in-depth articles about almost any health condition you can imagine. And we give you step-by-step protocols that other clinicians have used to help their clients heal and that are verified by evidence-based sources. You should totally check it out, and it'll transform your practice. And we can't wait to see you. So make sure you sign up today at rupahealth.com.